do his thing that you want to share, and then I'll just go in the background and help him with technology.
Yeah, let me. Okay, I just want to share the slides. Share. Can you see it?
Yep. Just make it full screen.
Slide. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, perfect.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to be talking. This was Zach's title, Secrets of the Aramaic Language. I'm not sure I would have used the word secrets, but it is appropriate in one sense, as Aramaic is sort of the neglected little brother of Hebrew in the Judaic world. It was a major language of the ancient Near East. In fact, it was the dominant language of the ancient Near East for many hundreds of years, almost a millennium. But it has, was displaced by Arabic with the rise of Islam, and it's become really much little known language, even though it played a major part in human history in many ways, particularly in Judaism and in Christianity, but even in Islam, Aramaic had an impact. Anyway, that's just the Syriac word, Aramaya, on the screen there. It's Syriac was and is the major ecclesiastical and liturgical language of many Eastern churches, Orthodox churches. It's been under those communities, as sadly as we know, have been under enormous stress in the last 20 years. Many have been forced to immigrate, but the churches are still going strong, and Aramaic is still spoken and still used in their church services all over. Anyway, to begin, once upon a time, Aramaic was a major language, but it is sadly now not so well known as it once was. The name, at least, is familiar to many people. Aramaic is even part of the Western literary canon, since parts of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, as it's known in Judaism. By the way, when I say the Bible in this talk, I like to be precise. The Bible is the Old Testament, the Jewish portion of the scriptures, and the New Testament is the Christian portion of the scriptures. That's the Bible. When I say the Old Testament, I mean the Jewish portion. I will call it the Tanakh because that is the Jewish name for it, the famous acronym. And for the New Testament, I'll call it the New Testament. So parts of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, were written in Aramaic. These include parts of the book of Daniel, chapters 2 through 7, which by the way, Daniel is one of the most exciting books in the Bible. It contains some of the most famous stories in it. Daniel in the lion's den, Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar was the last king of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. That was the dynasty that was responsible for the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. So they were roundly hated among the Jews. And so Belshazzar got the famous handwriting on the wall sent from God, and it meant a very, very bad thing for him since his kingdom fell the next day. Also had the 3 young men in the fiery furnace. So Aramaic was almost certainly Jesus's native language. He was speaking Aramaic when he formulated the Lord's Prayer and all the parables in the New Testament. And Aramaic is still part of the popular culture. It was in the last time, it may not be the last time it appeared in a movie, but the one I'm aware of was in the movie Passion of the Christ, where a form of Aramaic was used and spoken by Jesus. Many everyday expressions come from Aramaic. For example, the well-known expression feet of clay, meaning strong on the outside, weak in reality, is, if that is what it means, he has feet of clay. Yeah, that's more or less what it means. It comes from a Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and this is from Daniel chapter 2, about a strong-looking but ultimately vulnerable colossus. And I mentioned the writing on the wall above, which has entered many languages as a metaphor for a doom that is unavoidable. And that's exactly what happened to Belshazzar. And when you walk into an Indian restaurant anywhere in the world today and select a tandoori dish, please be aware that the word derives from an Aramaic word tanur, meaning oven. How did that word ever get to India, you ask? Aramaic may have originated in the Near East, but the Persian Empire brought it with them. Aramaic spread all over Eurasia. Aramaic was for many centuries the spoken language of the Jewish people. It supplanted Hebrew early on, and that's a topic I'll come back to. The Kaddish today, the Jewish bereavement prayer, is written in Aramaic. I was at a Seder once and was surprised to discover that a very famous song in it is called Chad Gadya, and it is mostly in Aramaic, not Hebrew. Chad is the Aramaic word for one. The title means one little goat. Chad is the Aramaic word for one. Echad is the Hebrew word for one. Now, Aramaic phrases occur in the New Testament. Now, as you might know, the New Testament was written in Greek, but some Aramaic occurs in it. Perhaps the most famous is Jesus' exclamation at the moment of his death on the cross, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. And I'm giving you the pronunciation as it's recorded in the Greek, which may or may not have been the same as what Jesus said. So, my God, why have you abandoned me? Now, that's the moment of his death. Now, we know that's Aramaic because the verb it uses, shabak, to leave, is typical of Aramaic, not Hebrew. In Hebrew, it would have been azavtani. Azav is what means leave in Hebrew. And actually, that phrase, my God, why have you abandoned me? It's a quote from the Old Testament, which is, of course, in Hebrew. And I forget where I think it may be from Ezekiel, that quote. Actually, I don't quite remember, but it's in the Old Testament somewhere. But it's a bit unclear why the New Testament, since it's written almost entirely in Greek, would contain these phrases. And other ones is when he speaks to a girl who died, and her father, a centurion, asks Jesus to resurrect her. He says, Talitha cum, little girl, rise, stand up, and she does so. But it's in Aramaic for some reason. In the case of the Eli, lama shabachthani, it may have been that the last living words of Christ were considered so holy they should not be translated but left in the original. On the other hand, as I said, I have it here. On the other hand, it's a quotation from Psalm 22 in the Old Testament, which suggests the writer of the gospel may have added it as a literary flourish of some kind. So the question is it a real life quote from Jesus remembered by his followers? By the way, the first gospel, what is considered the first gospel written, was the Gospel of Mark. Scholars think it was composed about 70 AD. Jesus died around 30 AD. So it's about a 2-generation, 40-year distance from the events they record. So is this a real life quote from Jesus? Or was it a learned interpolation by someone else? Jesus, of course, would likely have known the psalm, but we don't know a whole lot about his religious education, aside from his, famously debating the learned men in the temple and besting them, as I recall, at the age of 12. The fact, which sounds like a bit overdone, the fact that it's given in Aramaic does suggest it was really Jesus' statement, since his native language was almost certainly Aramaic. I'll come back to that in a little bit, but basically Jesus was from Galilee, grew up in a town called Nazareth, and he would have spoken Aramaic at that time. We know that. So Aramaic is also still alive today. You will encounter Aramaic-speaking communities in Sydney, Melbourne, Chicago, Detroit, London, Toronto, where have you. Sadly, it's the result of forced migration to escape annihilation in these currently very sad days. Aramaic is not one single uniform language. There are many variants of it. It started around 1000 BCE, before the Common Era. To put it more correctly, we don't know anything about the linguistic history of Aramaic before 1000, as it was unwritten and left no documents or inscriptions. It has survived, albeit with much smaller number of speakers up to the present. For many centuries, it was the dominant language in the Middle East until it was submerged by the rise of Islam and Arabic. From a cultural perspective, it was Aramaic speakers that shaped both Jewish and Christian scriptures. It even influenced other languages. The pronunciation of Hebrew, for example, was affected by the fact for a long time many Jews knew both languages. This was in antiquity. That influence has even reached to modern-day Israeli Hebrew. There's a typical Hebrew pronunciation of the consonants B, K, and P, the letters Bet, Kaf, and Pe. Kaf is pronounced as K when it's not following a vowel, but is pronounced as what linguists would call an X. That's the sound you find in the German composer's name, Bach. It's a sound made in the back of the throat with some friction. So you have pairs like he wrote in Hebrew is katav, in Israeli Hebrew and biblical Hebrew it would have been katav, but it's pronounced, the initial K is pronounced K in katav, but in another form of the same verb, yichtov, he will write, that K becomes an X. And that's something that Hebrew borrowed from Aramaic a long time ago, and it's survived. And that has a lot to do with when two languages, Hebrew and Aramaic, are pretty close. They weren't mutually comprehensible, but when people are bilingual in two languages and they're very close, it's very easy for one item, one thing to slip from one language to the other and just become, it's called convergence in linguistics jargon terminology. Two languages, when spoken in a bilingual community, can come to resemble each other more and more. Now, even the Arabic language Quran shows the influence of Aramaic, as it contains a number of Aramaic loanwords, including perhaps the name Quran itself. Now, before anybody gets upset, it was Arabic scholars in the Middle Ages who opened this discussion. They noticed there were lots of foreign terms in the Quran. It wasn't just a Western imposition. Even the Hebrew alphabet we know today, the so-called square script, you see it in every Bible and every Israeli newspaper, it started out as an Aramaic script and the Jews borrowed it. Why they decided to abandon their original script is unknown, but it was undoubtedly due to the increasing dominance of Aramaic in the Near East, which we'll cover in some detail.
John,
now, yes.
For that, first of all, I don't know if you plan to move your slides. We're still on the first one.
Oh no, it's
That's
no, it's correct.
It's
Yeah,
correct. Okay.
I sort of adopted this format as fewer slides, but a lot of information per slide.
The other thing that I have answered like a question, but I think you could give a little more comprehensive answer. Someone asked, what language did they speak in the Assyrian Empire?
Well, Assyrian, they spoke Assyrian. The Assyrian Empire, and there were older empires, but what's relevant to Aramaic is the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which is the first millennium. It arose in the 7th century, approximately, and it has the famous names like Sennacherib was one of the Neo-Assyrian kings. And the Assyrians themselves, the dominant group, would have spoken Assyrian, which is a dialect of Akkadian. That their empire consists of many speakers of other languages, and Aramaic was one of them. Sennacherib attempted to conquer Jerusalem and Judea. He failed, so the Israelites were not absorbed into the Israelite Empire, but they did absorb all sorts of other languages into the Assyrian Empire, like Moabite, which is a language closely related to Hebrew, a little bit to the east of Judea, Ammonite, about which little is known. I don't know if the Assyrians got as far as the coast, where they would have absorbed Phoenician. I don't think they did. So does that answer the question?
I think there is another question here. Did Aramaic emerge from cuneiform, Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian?
Well, let me defer that because I'm going to address it, I believe, on the next slide. The origins of Aramaic. No, it did not. It's a cousin language of cuneiform is a writing system. The most prominent languages written in cuneiform were Sumerian and Akkadian. Sumerian is unrelated to Aramaic, but Akkadian is a cousin of Aramaic, and I'll explain what that means in a couple of slides. Okay, so it's not an exaggeration to say that Aramaic was the most important language of the Middle East between, say, the Assyrian and Persian empires, that's say 700 to 300 BCE, and the coming of Islam in 7th century AD. This is actually a very strange fact, since as I will discuss further, Aramaic was itself never the language of a great empire. Usually, the language of a people goes to places where that people conquers other people. Latin spread because of the power of the Roman state in conquering other peoples. English spread because of the power of the British state and subsequently the American one. You could argue the American one was sort of through soft power, more through hard power, but it was definitely domination. Aramaic, by contrast, never had a great state backing it. Aramaic never had a great Aramaean state backing it. It never had a state run by Arameans. That's the ethnic term for the people speaking Aramaic. Aramaic started out as the language of a few small city-states in the Syrian Palestinian region in the early first millennium BCE. These were later snuffed out as independent entities by the rise of the Assyrian Empire in the middle of the first millennium BCE. But Aramaic, as opposed to the historical norm, Aramaic was adopted by the conquerors in an administrative governmental function, and it continued to rise in importance until the later Persian Empire. That's the Achaemenid, to name Achaemenid, to name the dynasty, but it's the Persian Empire that came from Persia. And why this happened is a major theme of this talk, because it is unusual in human history for the language of basically a conquered people to be used in a function. Usually the Arabic experience is the opposite. When Islam rose and the Arabian armies moved out and conquered North Africa and a large chunk of Eurasia, the trend was towards adoption of the language of the conquerors, with the signal exception of the Persians, of course, which retained the use of Persian. But the overall trend is pretty clear. Now, to switch, for the long-awaited switch to the second slide, this is a map of the original area of Aramaic. It was the only map I could find. It includes cities of non-Aramaic speaking people like Byblos, but looking at this slide, the major Aramaic centers would have been Damascus, Tadmor, and Hamath. These were Aramaic speaking in the early first millennium. Now, the name Aramaic, which was already in use in antiquity, is derived from the place name Aram, which originally roughly coincided with the area of the Syrian desert down towards what's now Saudi Arabia. The original meaning of the word, like many other well-known names, remains unknown. As an adjective used to refer to the Aramaic language and script, the word is first attested around 500 BCE. The earliest attested forms of Aramaic, that's known as Old Aramaic, come from Syria and date to the beginning of the first millennium BCE. That's the early Iron Age, which followed the Bronze Age, which ended at towards the end of the second millennium. In this period, the first millennium, the Iron Age, thanks to a power vacuum, there weren't any big powers like the Hittites and the Egyptians that controlled the area. Newly formed ethnic units grew into a number of small, originally independent societies that during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE further developed into more complex city-states. And each was under its own rule. Unfortunately for them, after a brief heyday, they were completely absorbed by the rising Assyrian Empire in the course of the second half of the 8th century, as it spread to the west from Mesopotamia at lightning speed. These early societies exhibited a socially stratified structure, specialization of work with dedicated professions like temple administrators and soldiers, and a strong centrally organized government, which facilitated the further growth of the economy. At a certain point, legal and administrative practice, but also a desire for creative expression, created the need for a written language. Taxes in kind, since there was no money, had to be recorded. Property had to be registered in a legally valid and convincing way. People also wanted to preserve memories of special deeds in war and peace, and also to produce what we would call literature. From this point onward, this is from the 9th and 8th centuries, inscriptions in the old Semitic alphabet, I won't go into that, I mentioned it in another talk. The alphabet was invented once in Egypt, probably by West Semitic speakers, and that's the ancestor of almost all the scripts outside of Asia in the world today. Inscriptions in the old Semitic alphabet began to appear that are written in the local population's language, Aramaic. The early inscriptions are already quite standardized and obviously written by professionals. In the ancient Near East, document formats, and this is quite true, document formats for things like proclamations, deeds, wills, etc., can be quite rigid. You always write a deed in the same way. And you see the sort of thing in modern bureaucracies today. If you write a contract, it has to be done in the appropriate way. But this began in the West and the ancient Near East. I don't know about China. I assume they went the same way, which written language was quite formal for most ancient peoples. So this sort of formality and standardization presuppose a supporting scribal culture with a trained group of scribes. Unfortunately, there's no trace in the textual record of how this situation developed. Already when Aramaic inscriptions appear on the scene, they are, if you will, they're already professionalized. Now, at about the same time, this is 8th and 9th century again, 9th and 8th century, we're going backwards. Similar things were happening in the southern area, south of this slide here, down here. This area is usually called Palestine, not in the current sense. It's a later Roman name that is used by scholars today. In the scholarly sense, it corresponds to the present day states of Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. So small city-states came into being, both Aramaic and non-Aramaic. The two kingdoms of ancient Israel and Samaria, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, also known as Judea. Also, there are Moabites, Ammonites, and Edomites to the east of the River Jordan. And you also have the Philistines on the Mediterranean coast. The status of the Philistines, they were part of the sea peoples who brought about the end of the Bronze Age. I think it was the only identified group among the sea peoples. It's unclear that they were even Semitic. There's evidence that they may have been speakers of an Indo-European language originally. The most famous Philistine, of course, is Goliath. The Hebrew Bible makes them look really bad, the Philistines, that they were deadly enemies of the Israelites. But the most famous Philistine was Goliath, who was killed by David. But Goliath doesn't have a good Semitic etymology and has been convincingly compared to Hittite terms. So they may not even have been Semitic. Now, Phoenician studies are higher up the coast here, like Tripoli and Byblos, on the coast of present-day Lebanon, I should say, together with the Aramaeans up in Syria, over in Syria. All these, this is the immediate historical backdrop of the Old Testament, as you might know. Culturally, these places were all similar. There was an administration centered on a capital city with a temple and a palace combined with more tribal structures in the hinterland. They were ruled by dynastic monarchs, and they venerated a local national god as the protector of the ruling dynasty. Now, I like this map quite a bit. It's a picture of the entire linguistic situation in the Middle East. It sort of collapses different time periods, so it's not entirely appropriate. But here you see what I was talking about. These are the Canaanite languages: Ammonite, Hebrew, Moabite, Edomite. Here's the Aramaic homeland up here. Eblite is really a kind of Akkadian. It's very old, so this had markers from different eras, but this indicates the overall structure of the Semitic languages. Arabic is down here. The size of the circles, I don't know if you can make it out, reflect the number of the population. But this map splits the Semitic area into three distinct areas. The area outlined in red is the central Semitic area, which in turn splits into northwest. That's the northwest on the map, which consists of the Aramaic languages and the Canaanite languages, including Hebrew. Further south is the Arabic member of the family. Now, the Eastern Aramaic is the Akkadian and Eblaite. That's a smaller area. And you see they overlap. The Arameans were the Akkadians, and the Eblaites had urbanized very early, and they were living in towns and villages. The Arameans, when they came along, were more semi-nomadic and nomadic. Down here in the southern area are the southern Semitic languages, and you have the east and south languages spoke in the south of the Arabian Peninsula, which aren't of concern today. And then you also have the Ethiopian languages spoken here. Now, here's another view. Yes?
Can I ask you a question? if I understood correctly, you said that the alphabet was developed in Egypt.
Yeah.
I was on the impression it was kind of a proto-Canaanite script.
That's a good catch. I misspoke. It's called the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet, developed in the Sinai. And it may have been workmen working on an Egyptian project, but they were probably West Semitic speakers because the alphabet is fitted for the sound system of what would have been some Semitic language. I don't know if it was as definite as I don't know if they can ID exactly what the language they were trying to represent. At that, it's any time between the 19th and the 15th century is when this script was invented, and that became the ancestor of everything in the West.
But you're saying it more probably was developed in Sinai?
Yeah, correct. The remnants or the archaeological clues were in the Sinai, I do believe.
Okay. So,
but it spread everywhere
yeah.
in the Near East. Now here's another view of the relations between the Semitic languages. It shows how close languages are to each other by their position in the chart. Now, linguistically, all the peoples I mentioned above, Hebrews, Judean Israelites, Arameans, Phoenicians, maybe not the Philistines, they may have been Indo-European, all the peoples mentioned above spoke very similar languages. Now, natural languages gradually take shape through a continuous process of evolution that an individual speaker is generally unaware of, and the way a language changes a little every generation. It's generally the younger people who may change the language, particularly young girls, many people think, making changes in the language. And most people aren't, in the course of their lifetimes, they aren't really that aware of how their language is changing. Now they can recognize new words, of course, but the other changes in pronunciation and syntactic phenomena, they generally aren't very aware of that. Now,
John, I apologize. There is a question here about the previous map. Patty is asking what time ranges does that map cover?
Well, I said it collapses different times. This is the early first millennium. Well, it includes all stages of Hebrew, so it really goes from the beginning of the first millennium up to early in the Common Period. Ugaritic is a language that dates from. It's hard to get everything on one map and not sacrifice some variable. And here it's doing time. Ugaritic was spoken in the 14th century BC and died out. They were destroyed by the city of Ugarit, the kingdom of Ugarit was destroyed by the Sea Peoples in the 13th century. These other languages down here emerged after the Dark Ages caused by the collapse of the Bronze Age. From 1200 to 900 BC, there was the Dark Age, and gradually these languages emerged. We don't know much, famously, we don't know where Abraham came from Mesopotamia, but what he was, he was the founder of the Hebrew nation, the Israelite nation. We don't know what he was ethnically. We don't know what language he spoke, because obviously he came to the land of Canaan from Mesopotamia. If you believe the Bible, there's no reason not to.
Right. Yeah, but then
we just don't know.
there are no historical kind of archaeological evidence.
It's only in the
Bible.
9th and 8th. Yeah, I'll come back to that. There's only one extra biblical reference to the house of David that has been found. It was found about 30 years ago. It's the only non-biblical evidence for the existence of the Davidic dynasty, and it's in an Aramaic inscription, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But I'll come back to it. Anyway, these languages exist at a different time depth. Eblide and Akkadian Eblide was a 3rd millennium BC language, so it was long dead by the time the Aramaic nomads appeared. And Akkadian lasted from the 3rd millennium all the way to the Common Period. It died around 200 AD. But by that time, it was strictly a scribal language. All these were first millennium. Arabic, of course, emerged. I think the earliest Arabic inscription is 5th century BCE. And it, of course, sort of hung around in the Arabian Peninsula, not going anywhere. But then with the rise of Islam, it exploded and took over the entire Middle East and beyond.
There is a question here
Yes.
regarding that. How quickly did Arabic spread?
There's a great lack of, well, main spread. The Arabic conquest moved amazingly fast. I mean, the Arab armies, in a couple of centuries, they had gone. They were in Morocco on the west, and they had made it to well into Central Asia on the east. The other question is, how quickly did Arabic get transmitted from the conquering groups to the conquered groups? And in some places, Arabic became the standard language of people who previously did not speak Arabic in the Middle East, in Iraq, and all across the African coast. Other places, as I mentioned, like Iran, Arabic did not manage to penetrate the population very much, probably because Persian is an Indo-European language and structurally very different from Arabic. It's much easier to spread a language when they're structurally similar. And Arabic and all the other Semitic languages are fairly closely related. So it's much easier for a person speaking, I don't know, Phoenician, to pick up Arabic. And the Arab conquerors had a good policy of running an empire. They sort of left people alone. They had to pay the head tax, and the Arabs were very happy to let non-Arabs achieve high status in their administration. So it became quite, for any ambitious person in the Islamic Empire, whatever their origin, it behooved them to learn Arabic, and they did, and over centuries. But the time frame is very unclear. It seems to have taken forever in Egypt, many centuries, of the population to switch over to Arabic, and they didn't do it completely. The Copts, which now constitute about 10% of the population, of course, the Egyptian government doesn't permit publication of statistics on that. They still use Copt in their sacred, in their religious ceremonies, but they have switched over to Arabic for the most part. But it did take many centuries. Unfortunately, very little is known about that. Hope I did.
John, can I just say something?
Yeah.
The most interesting aspect to me, Arabic language spreading. How did it spread to like Volga, Bulgars, and this mountainous area of Caucasus, right? And at one point, also Oleg, who was the Rurik, that Viking or Varangian that ruled Russia, he was looking for a new religion because they were pagans. And Arabic was the Muslim religion was presented to him as one of the religions he can choose. And he said, okay, what is the advantages of it? Well, you can't drink in our religion, so we can't pick it. So,
yes, that's a famous story. It may well be true. He called all the contractors in and asked them to make their best pitch. He called in the Jews, the Christians, and the Arabs. And when he heard that the Arabs didn't allow alcohol, they lost. Well, that was anyway, I hope it's a complex map, but it does sacrifice the dimension of time to getting all the Semitic languages on it. But I like it because it gives you a very clear idea of the geographical spread. Anyway, any more questions?
No, that was chat.
I
So
can't hear
please,
you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. By the way, anyone have a question, please put it in the chat and I'll read it. Okay.
Yeah, that's the best way to do it. Where was I? Now, as I said, all the peoples I mentioned that occur in the Bible, except for the Philistines, they all spoke very similar language. Now, the sounds, grammar, and vocabulary of the earliest texts in Old Aramaic, remember that's the 9th and 8th century, they already allow us to quite clearly distinguish Aramaic from these neighboring languages, including Hebrew, Phoenician, Moabite, and Ammonite. These four, by the way, they're all grouped together, as I should have mentioned earlier, they're all grouped together under the term Canaanite. which is derived from the term Canaan, which refers to this period, this area right here. The etymology of Canaan is quite unknown, but that's what the area is called. The first term that we have for Hebrew in the Bible, it's called the Safat Canaan, the language of Canaan. And it's the southern part of Syria, Palestine. Now you can see many systematic correspondences between Aramaic and these Canaanite languages. Let me go back here. Oops, went the wrong way. The systematic correspondences we do have suggest quite strongly that Aramaic and Canaanite developed from the same ancestor. This would be similar to the way English, German, Swedish, and other languages developed from the same Germanic language family. So very impressionistically, we could compare the difference between the Aramaic of Damascus in Syria, which was an Aramaic-speaking city-state way back when. We could compare the difference between the Aramaic of Damascus and, for instance, the Hebrew of Jerusalem at that time. We could compare it to the difference between Standard English and Standard High German, because they probably, if you know English, you don't automatically understand High German. You can see the similarities, but you still have to learn it. What the Aramaic and Hebrew of that time would have been mutually incomprehensible, but obviously related, because so much of the vocabulary is shared. For one thing, the word for God is El in Hebrew, would have been something similar in Aramaic. And correspondingly, the difference between Hebrew and Phoenician on the coast would then resemble that between Standard English and Scots English. Both Hebrew, well, that's not entirely true. I saw a movie made in Scottish dialect. What was it called? It's about drug addicts about 30 years ago. Train Spotting. And I couldn't understand the Scots at all. It should have had subtitles, but they are considered mutually comprehensible. But so both Hebrew and Phoenician would have been mutually comprehensible, but not Aramaic would not have been comprehensible by the speakers of the other two. Now, these similarities are traditionally captured by a language tree view of the relationship, which is what you see on this slide. You can see it's from this Hebrew and Phoenician are considered closer to each other than either is to Aramaic. You think of Aramaic occupies the uncle or the aunt relationship to Hebrew and Phoenician, if you consider the Canaanite family to be a sibling of the Aramaic family. And these others I won't discuss today. These others are siblings of the two. And so you go up the tree. As you go up the tree, you go farther back in time. Northwest Semitic would have been the ancestor of all of these. Northwest Semitic we don't have any evidence for it. It's reconstructed by all the features that these lower languages in the tree have in common. And behind Northwest Semitic, you get to Central Semitic, which comprises all of these languages. And behind Central Semitic, you get to all of West Semitic, which includes these languages, and they're opposed to East Semitic, which only includes two, Eblaite and Akkadian. And at this point, we're back around the turn of the third millennium BC. And before that, you get to the ultimate ancestor, at least in called Proto-Semitic by linguists. That's a technical term. It's based on all the similarities among these languages that we can reasonably project to having existed in the ancestral language. But this ancestral language is not attested. It's a theoretical construct, and there's constant ongoing argumentation about what belongs in Proto-Semitic and what doesn't. But anyway, that's the emergence of Aramaic. It's unknown when Aramaic originated as a separate language and what exactly the borders of its original territory were. Presumably, many aspects of the language took shape during the second millennium. At that time, and this was before the establishment of any city-states in Syria, it was the exclusively spoken, it must have been the exclusively spoken language of a nomadic population that did not yet have its own writing system, and therefore did not leave any textual traces. In Assyrian sources, Assyria was a literate culture back then in the second millennium. In Assyrian sources, however, from the century leading up to 1000 BCE, we find the term Aramayu, i.e. the Aramaeans, which refers to various dispersed clans who occupied themselves with small-scale agriculture and pastoralism. They tended sheep and goats. They most likely also spoke various Aramaic dialects, but this is obviously merely a hypothesis. It is also unknown to what degree these dialects already resembled the Aramaic of the earliest inscriptions from the 9th and 8th century. In other words, the origins of Aramaic are quite obscure. Abraham, for example, may have been, when he lived in Mesopotamia, he may have been an Aramaic speaker, a speaker of an ancestor of Aramaic. We just don't know. Also unclear in this connection is what we do have some literary evidence, also unclear as to what to make of the historical significance of a few Bible passages that presuppose a familial relationship between the patriarchs of the people of Israel and the Arameans, such as the well-known description, which I mentioned in my Hebrew talk, describes Abraham as a, quote, wandering Aramean, Arami Oved in the Hebrew, a wandering Arab. What does that mean? The stories in Genesis, one thing about Abraham, he may have been Aramean. He certainly did wander. He moved. We don't know why he moved exactly. There's in the Bible, it says because God told him to, but maybe there was, there was a mega drought or something going on in Mesopotamia at the time. We just don't know. The other evidence, the stories in Genesis about Laban, the Aramean, who was Jacob's father-in-law, Jacob the patriarch. There is no scholarly consensus on what the Israelites were thinking when they included things like this in the Bible. They probably reference folk memories that some of their relatives were Arameans, but we really just don't have any evidence on that. Now, as opposed to all that ethnological confusion, a murkiness, another interesting thing about Aramaic is that we can define the Aramaic language quite precisely based on grammatical features, which I'll give you some of them soon. But as I said, ethnologically, the Arameans are quite shadowy. And it's more than just linguistic here. We do not know what shared myths or legends, specific religious practices or customs and habits they may have had in this early Old Aramaic period, early first millennium. Currently available textual and archaeological evidence does not allow us to further flesh out the concept of Arameans as an ethnic concept compared to Israelites, Phoenicians, and others. If you recall, the Israelites gave us the Bible. They had lots of myths and legends. The Phoenicians, even though they were a commercial people, traders, and didn't produce any great literature that I'm aware of, they did in their funerary monuments. We do get a good picture of their religious beliefs and others. So for the Arameans, the major reason is the absence of creative, religious, mythical folk tales or other cultural writings from this early period or even later period. Also, basically, the Arameans did not produce a culture that has come down to us. Also, their conquest of their city-states by the Assyrians created a situation where there is no evidence for a shared ethnic or cultural Aramean identity after the 8th century BCE. Nobody really called themselves an Aramean after that conquest. How long that took, I don't know, but it just was, as a group, it kind of disappeared. It was absorbed into larger units. But the language took a different route. What the Arameans did have, in contrast to the relative lack of other cultural markers, is a new alphabet-based writing culture.
John, I have
Yes.
a question, a few
Yes.
questions here. So first, and it's kind of related to what you were saying, because the script that Arameans developed were from alphabetic. But the question was, how were, Beverly is asking, how were these languages communicated? I tried to answer it, but I think you would give more comprehensive answer.
Well, they were different language. How did they communicate? Some were mutually comprehensible, most were not. So a Hebrew speaker could talk to a Phoenician speaker and probably get a pretty good result from the conversation, but a Hebrew speaker could not talk to an Aramaic speaker and get much, and wouldn't get much out of it. That's hypothetical, obviously, but looking at the languages, that seems probable.
Yeah. Yeah, basically what I said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it was from a different angle. That was communicated orally originally, but then when the Aramaic script was developed,
Yeah.
it was superior to cuneiform, and it started to slowly replace cuneiform, but it took centuries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, from a written sense, yes, it replaced. Yeah, in the ancient world, the spoken and written languages, the gap between them was much larger than today because the rate of literacy was so minuscule. So typically in these societies, the spoken language would have been greatly different from what people wrote, because that would have been restricted to a small can I say this, scribal group.
Right.
And so today, when most people get at least a high school education, they tend to speak more like the written version of the language. It has a standardizing effect on the way people communicate. But in the ancient world, it was a totally different kettle of fish, actually. So.
I just wanted to add that, as you said, like cuneiform, it was so hard to learn how to use it that very few specialists. But once, this alphabetic script was developed, more people, it was easier to learn. More people started to get. And as a matter of fact, when I was taking a course, they were saying that correspondence was carried often in both languages, but if they wanted something secret, they would do it in cuneiform because very few people could read it, while regular mail was in Aramaic. So they were
that I didn't know. It makes perfect sense.
Well, I took the course from Munich University about this. So there is more questions here. So did the Babylonian exile have little appreciable effect on Hebrew?
Well, by itself, the major effect it has, the Babylonian exile. Well, let me defer that. I'll come back to it in some detail.
Okay, but let me go through other questions here.
Yeah.
So this is more of a comment. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Ileana said that Abraham came from Aram. Well, that's news to me.
It came from Ur of the Chaldees, as I recall.
Yeah, according to Bible. But my understanding, I'm sure you can talk about this, that I understand David, yes, recognized now because of that find of the stela, that it was a historical figure, but nothing beyond that, as far as if history, archaeology is concerned. Well, there are also said Naharim, which is the north, Syria, Iraq. So maybe his family brought Aramaic to Judea and Israel. That's the comment, I guess.
Yeah, he may have brought Aramaic. We don't have population statistics on speakers of Aramaic in Mesopotamia versus speakers of other languages. So it's all a guessing game, really, as to what Abraham may have spoken. It could well have been Aramaic, though.
Yeah, another comment is that the family tree implies that some appreciable distance between Babylonian and Hebrew.
Yeah, correct. They are very different languages. I don't want to get into that. They had Babylonian, Akkadian is the name of the parent language of Babylonian and Assyrian, and it had a drastically different verbal system from Hebrew. That in fact is the basis of the split between West Semitic and East Semitic.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think Akkadian represents the older situation and West Semitic innovated. Other people think it's the other way around. Those are all very controversial areas because it's so far back in time. There are so many unknowns. But
another thing is the question is like what time period between Assyrian cuneiform and Sumerian cuneiform?
Well, Sumerian cuneiform got going in the at the turn of the third millennium, about 3000 BC, with pictograms. They were started out as an accounting technique. They would write the picture of something and write the number of how many things they had, like sheaves of grain and containers of beer, stuff like that. And it continued down and survived as a living language. It survived to about 2000, and then it became a learned language within the Akkadian context. See, the Sumerians were non-Semitic. We don't know where they came from, and Sumerian is not related to any other language. They just sort of sit there, and they're the people who invented writing. But they were overwhelmed by Semitic nomads beginning in the mid-millennium BC, and those nomads settled down, a great many of them, and started building empires. And they're known today as the Akkadians. And what was the other language that Sumerian is close to?
The Assyrian, which is Akkadian.
Yeah, Syrian. They're from very different language families. Structurally, they don't look like each other at all, but they share Sumerian culture had a huge impact on Akkadian. There are many Sumerian loanwords in Akkadian. Like the cultural impact was enormous. The Gilgamesh story started out there were stories written by Sumerian speakers in the third millennium. Apparently, they were all at the time. That whole Gilgamesh cycle was adopted by the Akkadian scribes, and they turned it into the Epic of Gilgamesh. So there was a close symbiosis of the two cultures, sort of a lot like the Greeks and the Romans. The Romans sort of looked up to the Greeks as their cultural elders, and all aristocratic Romans learned how to speak Greek, and they went to study in Athens and learned Greek philosophy. But they kept their original Latin language, but many Greek loanwords were borrowed into Latin. So it's a similar relation. You can think of it as California, as Greece and Samaria was sort of like the California. When I was younger, when I was 30, everybody wanted to move to California and be like Californians, but things have changed since then. But it's just some cultures just become fashionable. The cool cultures. And it's usually connected to a culture that doesn't have, Latin didn't have a strong, when they encountered Greek, they didn't have a strong literary tradition. So they just kind of looked up to that one and adopted it. Of course, then they later developed their own literature.
There's another little question. Wayne Rockman asking, Av means father in Hebrew. Does Avra have a meaning?
Father, Avram, there's an interesting notion of changing names in the Bible. His original name was Avram, which is Av is far, Ram refers to a high place. Then it gets changed to Avraham, and his wife Sarai becomes Sarah. And the name change is, I've never quite had it explained to me why that's so significant a name change, but it's quite a feature. But it does have a reading in Hebrew that may be a folk etymology. It may not be the original meaning of the name, because if he was a non, there's no information. I don't think that the name Avram or Avraham reveals anything about the ethnic identity of the person.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, my message is it's all kind of a mystery. So, okay, that's it. Well, here's the old Aramaic script. If you know, what you have is on the top row, you have the old Aramaic characters themselves. Underneath, you have the Hebrew equivalents. Third line are the Aramaic names of the letters, and you can see, if you know Hebrew, you can see that it looks a lot: Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin, Chet, Tet, Yud, Kaf, Lamed, Mem, Nun, Semek, Ayin, and here in Aramaic is known as A, Pei, Tzaddik, Kof, Resh, Shin, Tau. There are 22 letters, and the fourth line here is the phonetic interpretation of them. As you can see, it's a lot like Hebrew. Now, this is originally borrowed from the Phoenician alphabet, which I'll show you in a little bit. One of the characteristics here is is that the Phoenician, for some reason, it's unknown, a lot of states, city-states, and people adopted that Proto-Sinaitic script. For some reason, Phoenician got the lead, and other people started borrowing the form of the alphabet that Phoenician had. Phoenician lost a lot of sounds that were in Proto-Semitic and were inherited by Old Aramaic, but Phoenician had lost them. So the problem for the Aramaeans adopted the alphabet, even though their language, as far as we can reconstruct, had 29 consonantal sounds, and Phoenician had 22. So basically, the old Aramaeans had to stuff all the sounds of their language into 22 letters, and so you get, and that's a common phenomenon. Usually, our alphabets are borrowed because they have high status, and it may or may not be a good fit for the speakers for the language it's being adopted by. I mean, that happened to English when the Christian monks came to England in the 6th century AD, I believe, to Christianize the natives. The natives already had their own script, but the monks imposed the Latin script, the Latin letters, and unfortunately, Latin has a number of letters is in the 20s. I forget how many exactly. Maybe one of you can help me. But English had number of sounds was 44, as I recall. And of course, they were writing vowels and consonants too, where the Semitic scripts early on are strictly consonantal. But that caused a huge mismatch between writing and sound that has persisted to this day. Anyway, I'm getting off topic again. Now, to get back to the old Aramaic script, let's back up a few centuries now, back from the first millennium, and give the background of the emergence of a written Arabic. During the second half of the second millennium, the late Bronze Age, the written language used across the Near East, and particularly in Syria, Palestine, for local and international correspondence was usually not Egyptian or Hittite, the language of two of the major empires of the time. The main language used for writing was Akkadian, a Semitic language. That's cuneiform is the name of the writing system, but the language was Akkadian, a Semitic language from Mesopotamia, which I discussed in a previous talk. It had great cultural prestige, as I mentioned. It was one of the most ancient language civilizations in the region, with an impressive literature. It used cuneiform, which is a script that uses hundreds of different signs imprinted on clay tablets with a reed stylus, each representing whole syllables of the entire words. Due to the great ambiguity of the signs and all kinds of learned spelling conventions, cuneiform had to be mastered, as someone said earlier. Cuneiform had to be mastered as part of a formal scribal education, which also introduced the students to the basis of a general literary canon. They used to copy the famous texts like Gilgamesh as part of their training. The system was so well developed and so established that it did not change easily. One scholar that I consulted pointed out an advantage of cuneiform that I was not aware of. A trained specialist could achieve a fairly high writing speed with cuneiform with a technique comparable to a stenographer's. Now, I don't believe that because I've tried to write cuneiform. Maybe in the ancient world, somebody could go get really fast at writing those signs, but I'm a bit skeptical. Now, at the same time as Akkadian was being used in international correspondence between the various empires, the local languages of Syria, Palestine, including Aramaic, were generally not written due to they just didn't have a proper writing system. In this period, an early alphabet, this is the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet that was mentioned earlier, it was invented. This alphabet would eventually become the ancestor of most writing systems in the modern world, where cuneiform had written whole syllables with one sign. They would have a separate sign for ba, bi, bu, for the different syllables, which consists of consonants and vowels. But cuneiform had written whole syllables. The alphabet focused on the consonants, and that has to do with the structure of the Semitic languages. Consonants are just much more prominent, and the respective roles of consonants and vowels they're quite different in the grammar of the language. But that, for whatever reason, the alphabets only wrote the consonants in the early days. It changed as it went on, and they had one symbol for each one. Now, since syllables represent combinations of vowels and consonants, but early Semitic alphabets only had consonants, that means you need a much smaller number of distinct signs, 22 in the case of Phoenician, as I said, as opposed to hundreds of cuneiform. Now, also, since you can see the advance in people's thinking, since there's been a lot of children's first language acquisition research done, since people intuitively break words up into syllables, but do not split syllables up further into consonants and vowels, unless they're familiar with alphabetic scripts. And has been confirmed by current research, I might point out. The alphabetic principle was not at all obvious. In the second millennium, it didn't make much progress. It was only in the first that it did, eventually supplanting cuneiform completely. This was a revolution in human affairs comparable to the invention of the printing press. Now, what's interesting about Aramaic in the early first millennium BC, one of the things that's interesting, to me anyway, is that although it was spread over a fairly large area and there were probably different dialects, it didn't take long for the language to be standardized over the area. In fact, the old Aramaic inscriptions all show the same characteristics and indicate that a standard version of the language had spread over Syria. Now, that's usually associated with political power. A state, when it grows and it conquers other people and dominates them, in the interest of running their empire more smoothly, they standardize things, and they do that to language too. It's a way of, as I'll describe in a later part of the talk, the Achaemenids sort of took standardization of everything in running their empires, so the same orders would be communicated in exactly the same language in their domains in Afghanistan and in Egypt, a distance of several thousand miles. But anyway, it seems to have happened very early to the Arameans. It's also clear that local Aramean dialects survived because they themselves, in subsequent centuries, in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the Hellenistic period being from the death of Alexander down to 31 BC, and the Roman period would be thereafter. These dialects, they were under the radar at the time because they weren't being written. The standard language was being written. These undocumented Aramaic dialects would form the basis of new regional written languages when the original standard language died out for whatever reason. Now, it's usually assumed that the creation of an Aramaic standard language was a result of the rise of the kingdom of Aram, centered on the city-state. Let me go back. Right there, right here. This is, where is Damascus? I don't see it here. It's on another map. Well, you all know the geography.
No, it was on that map.
I missed it?
Yeah, it's on the.
Oh, there it is. I just missed it. There was a city-state that grew here in the 8th and 9th century, the period of Old Aramaic, that established a kingdom about this large. It was the first Aramaean kingdom, and it's responsible undoubtedly for the standardization of the language. Now, this kingdom of Damascus not only spread throughout Syria, it also started to impinge on the areas south of Syria. Most exciting in connection with this was the discovery of a stela. A stela, by the way, that's spelled S-T-E-L-E. It's a rectangle. It's a term scholars use for a rectangular stone of metal. It's a stone slab, and it's for recording official decrees or other formal matters. And there's a picture of it, of one there. They discovered a stela in Tel Dan, which is a site located on the border between southern Syria and northern Galilee in Israel. It preserves an account of an Aramaic ruler's campaign against the kings of Israel and Judah. We do not know the ruler's name for sure, as the stela was recovered only in fragments. It was probably a guy named Hazael, but it's not certain. Scholars mostly think it dates from the second half of the 9th century BCE. They do dating a lot from changes in the form of the letter. The alphabet also evolved over time, and they can date inscription based on the exact shapes of the letters, because all the peoples in the area were using variants of the same alphabet by this time. Most scholars think this dates from the second half of the 9th century BCE. The discovery was discovered in 1993 and 4. It caused a great, I've mentioned this before, it caused a great sensation both for the media and for scholars, for it contains what seems to be an early extra-biblical reference to King David's dynasty. At least if these letters, if they do, it spells out B-Y-T-D-W-D. B-Y-T-D-W-D. And it goes right to left as a good Semitic script goes. And that just means the house of David. It would have been pronounced Beit. Hebrew would have pronounced it, the house of would be pronounced as Beit, but in Old Aramaic, the diphthong was still uncontracted, as we say, it was Beit David. And that is the house of David. Now, let's just to double check. See, that's the B in the Old Aramaic. If we go back to our dictionary, that's what it looks like in Old Aramaic. And this, you can see it's the same. I won't do the whole thing. You can see here the name David, the DWD. The D looks like a Greek delta. The Greeks borrowed the alphabet from the Phoenicians at a later date, but their letter delta D looks a lot like the Old Aramaic D. So this is, and there's more than just this phrase. This is where it gets really conclusive, is the stela details that an individual killed Jehoram of Israel, the son of Ahab, and king of the house of David. These writings corroborate passages from the Bible, as the second book of Kings mentions that a certain Jehoram, named the same as in the Aramaic inscription, also Joram, that was another name, a variant of his name, is the son of an Israelite king Ahab. Same name by his Phoenician wife Jezebel. I don't think she's mentioned in the stela. She is mentioned. So this Aramaic inscription, and the likely candidate, as I said, for having erected it is a king named Hazael, an Aramaic king, tells the same story as we find in the second book of Kings. So this is quite conclusive. They're talking about David of the Bible. And as I said, nobody had any direct evidence outside the Bible that anybody like David or Solomon or Saul ever existed. Now, the stela also records that Hazael, the Aramean king, he conquered the land of Israel, though he was unable to take Jerusalem. I don't know if that's reflected in the Bible. Now, let's go back a few centuries once again.
Can I ask
Yes.
a question quickly?
Yeah.
Someone, Wayne Rothman wrote here, the name, he goes back to that question of name of Abraham
Yes.
could be connected to the word Hebrew AVR, could mean the plural, possibly fathers. And what's your thought on that?
The plural of father is Av is Avot. I don't think there's a plural there. I mean, in biblical Hebrew, the plural of Av is Avot, as it is in modern Hebrew, I believe. So I don't think. Yeah, I don't like etymologies of names are always can be very murky, and it's for a lot of them it's a guessing game. Some of them are obvious, but for many it's a guessing game. There's no strange. But anyway, where was I? Well, this is the Phoenician alphabet here. As I mentioned, after the collapse of the Near East in the late Bronze Age, there opened a dock, you know, what scholars call the Dark Ages. It's roughly from the 12th to 9th century BCE. We can't say much of anything due to the low level of material culture and the extremely limited spread of literacy. After the 9th century, civilization gradually began to recover. This seems to be the moment when the need for a writing system of some sort became clear. The advantages of the alphabet stood out. It was readily accessible. Remember, a smaller number of signs as opposed to cuneiform. It was not bound to complicated and lengthy study programs. It was, you wrote a word the way it sounded like, not like in English or French today, but very much like in Spanish or Italian. They don't have spelling bees in Italian because the spelling reflects the sounds of the language so well. At least I don't think they have spelling bees. They would be very easy. So it was not, you didn't have to spend a lot of time learning how to use it. In fact, no, there weren't, there would have been obviously different individuals would have spelled things differently, just because that's the way humans are. But as I mentioned, things became standardized, at least in the Aramaic kingdoms, very quickly into a standard form of the language with fixed orthography. Now, since the knowledge of Akkadian had disappeared from Syria, Palestine during the Dark Ages, scribes started to write the indigenous dialects of Aramaic, Hebrew, Phoenician, and their relatives, which promoted them to official languages. They had written form. As I said, and when I mentioned languages became standardized, it wasn't just the spelling, it affected, there were fixed formats developed for written texts of different types. And as I mentioned, you see that a lot. In the ancient world, they had a lot less variety in how they wrote things like letters, receipts, contracts, and narrative prose. Now, it's not known how knowledge of this early alphabetic script was transmitted during the Dark Ages. It seems, though, that the Phoenicians took the lead. The letter Aleph, for example, that's a Phoenician word for Alf, meaning ox. And that's the first letter, that's the name of the letter in the alphabet. You can see it on the upper left there. That's supposed to be an ox head. You can see the ideographic background of it. It's become greatly standardized, but they named it after the object it's associated with, Alf and ox. And we know it's not, this is a Phoenician alphabet because the Aramaic word for ox was stawa. It was a completely different word. Now, however it happened, the Phoenician alphabet spread around Syria, Palestine. So, as I said before, the Phoenician alphabet wasn't a perfect fit for Aramaic phonetically, but they just lived with it. There were two signs. To go back to the actual, this is structurally, you can see the similarities between this Phoenician alphabet. If you just look at the Waw here, Hebrew Vav, you see the Vav here, same letter. Same order of the letters too, alphabet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Bab. That order is pre-Phoenician to show how conservative writing systems can be. The Ugaritic language, dating from the 14th century, had a similar alphabet with the same order of elements. Except they didn't use they used cuneiform to write an alphabet. It's the only case in the ancient Near East where cuneiform was used for an alphabetic purpose. But their alphabet varied from the Phoenician one, but it still had the same basic order, which is still the order of the alphabet in modern day Hebrew. Arabic is the outlier here. I won't go into it, but Arabic had originally the same order of the letters, but they rearranged them in terms, they put the letters that resemble each other together in the alphabet, but you can still see traces of the original Semitic ordering. So you have an order of essentially the same order of the alphabet, beginning sometime before 1400 BC and continuing up to today. It's quite amazing, a piece of cultural resiliency. So I talked about the Tel Dan inscription. Also, the Aramaic inscription went further south into the Palestinian area. It was clear that there was a fair amount of bilingualism involving Hebrew and Canaanite in this period as the group started to mix. You can see that because the two languages started to develop in parallel fashion, both subfamilies, and they aren't individual families really, Canaanite and Aramaic. Both subfamilies used similar strategies in the first centuries of the first millennium BCE. They marked definiteness, the difference between a king and the king. Both languages added a definite article. The difference between them, Hebrew had a prefix, as in HaMelech is the king. Aramaic used a suffix, a prefix is something you stick onto the beginning of a word, as in prefix, pre is the prefix. A suffix is something you add on to the end of a word. And for where Hebrew had ha-melech, where the definite article was an initial H, Aramaic, and this is a major difference between the two languages, they had a final A, malka, the king. That last syllable indicates the definite article, and that's obviously a big difference between the two. There was another similarity that developed in the two the language family in Hebrew. They developed a dedicated particle marking a noun as the direct object. In English, we might say, the man hit the ball and the ball is the object of the action. But if we did say, that could change, it could become the man hit to the ball, where the to becomes the marker of the direct object. Now, we don't do that in English, but it's a common phenomenon in languages, and both Aramaic and Hebrew adopted it. And you can find it everywhere. There's a similar phenomenon if you know Spanish, in modern day Spanish, where they mark direct objects with a particular preposition. It's fairly common. Now, these types of change, it's called convergence by linguists, where languages become more similar. These types of change usually imply far-reaching contacts between the speakers of the various languages in question, i.e. there was intensive contact between them. There was lots of people who could speak both, somewhat perfectly, somewhat imperfectly. There would have been a mix of that sort of factor. But it's enough to cause languages to become more similar. Now, a great change happened after the Old Aramaic period. Aramaic, which has been modestly spreading due to the dominion of the Kingdom of Damascus, that's an Aramean kingdom, it got supercharged by a strange event. I won't say very strange event. The Assyrian Empire, based in Mesopotamia to the east, started a westward expansion in the 8th century, annexing the local kingdoms one by one. This means the end of any Aramean political entity, as I said. For the Aramaic language, however, it meant introducing it to the crucial imperial context that would form the basis of its further spread over the entire Near East and its metamorphosis into a world language. By the way, I'm saying that Aramaic is the basis of, in saying that Aramaic became a world language, I'm following the lead of probably the greatest Aramaicist of our time, Holger Petzela, who is a Dutch Aramaicist. He's an academic. That's his specialty. So a lot of my ideas on this are derived from him. I must give credit there if he ever listens in. But it became a world language. And of course, it's world not in the sense of our world, but in the sense of the world they knew, the ancient Near East, and they had very vague ideas of anything beyond that at the time. The Assyrians decided to use Aramaic as an administrative governing language for its entire empire in conjunction with Akkadian, which they had been using. As I said, Assyrian, this gets confusing, I know, but Assyrian is a dialect of Akkadian. The reasons for this are unclear. Maybe the Assyrian government really recognized the relative ease of using an alphabet-based language rather than the more cumbersome cuneiform. If that is true, one can imagine the struggle between the scribes versed in cuneiform versus the newcomers who wrote in an alphabet. But sadly, we have no information about that. I'm sure there were some tensions at the royal court about that sort of thing, but we don't have any information. But even though it was easy to use, it couldn't have been the only motivation for using an alphabet. As I mentioned, cuneiform was used earlier all over the Near East in the late Bronze Age, and today the even more complex Chinese writing system is still going strong. I mean, it has thousands of signs. You have to get through grade school. You have to learn thousands of signs in China and in Japan, which has a similar writing system. Now, in the 1950s, Mao Zedong did consider Romanizing Chinese, i.e. the communists were really quite progressive that way. He did consider Romanizing Chinese. He wanted to go alphabetical and move away from their complicated logographic system, which is similar to Akkadians, though much more complex. But in the end, he didn't, and I don't think we know why exactly. It may have been too big a cultural jump, but he did think about. Also thought about getting rid of personal names and giving people numbers, but he moved away from that too. So In addition to the easy to use factor, demographic processes must therefore have also played a role. The Assyrians practically had their well-known policy of deporting entire populations within the Assyrian Empire. They did this consistently, and it was meant to destabilize, deracinate, and weaken conquered areas. And it's a very good policy if that's your aim. Many Aramaic speakers could have been sent to other parts of their empire. An expansion of trade due to the growth of the empire could likely lead to migration and a transfer of cultural habits. As evidence of this increased movement, you do find a growing number of typically West Semitic names, i.e. non-Akkadian ones, in Mesopotamia, where the Assyrian capital was located. There may even have been Aramaean units in the Assyrian army, but I think the evidence for that is pretty weak, but people have claimed that. Now, one surprising factor may have been Aramaic's prestige among non-native speakers of Aramaic. There was a non-Aramaic kingdom, maybe non-Aramaic. There were arguments over the status of the language, what kind of language it was called Sam'al, located in the far northwest of Syria, which had its own Aramaic or non-Aramaic language. In the last phases of this kingdom, the last king of the Samalian dynasty switched to Aramaic of the kind that was starting to spread through Syria. All inscriptions on stones, seals, and bars of silver are in Aramaic. Perhaps this kind of switch was due to simultaneous rise of the Assyrian Empire. In any event, Aramaic, for whatever reason, was becoming a highly fashionable language. It would go on to even greater things.
John?
Yes.
First, if I may add, at the time of the Assyrian conquest of Israel, right, they did a lot of relocations.
Correct.
They relocated the Jews or into many different areas, but they also relocated people from Syria into Samaria, and that also could have contributed to the use of Aramaic. In that, because the populated area had to be repopulated, and they moved people from Syria. So that's one thing. But Beverly asked a question here. I don't know exactly what she's referring with the period of time. She asked, why did Hebrew became more prominent than Aramaic? Did it occur because Hebrew was prominent amongst the more educated?
Well, that's another story, but Hebrew produced the Hebrew Bible, which is the most important document produced in the West. Great cultural prestige up there with Homer over the centuries among Jews and non-Jews. Aramaic produced nothing comparable, even though it as a language in everyday use and informal context, it was politically far more important than Hebrew ever was, because the Hebrews lost their state on more than one occasion. It never expanded, but culturally it's one of those great paradoxes of history. You can think of Hebrew as the high language, the cultured language, and Aramaic a sister language, but it was the workaday language. And there's still many mysteries about why Aramaic spread so far and wide. I haven't even gotten to the largest extension yet.
So let's say in the time of Jesus, in terms of spoken language in Palestine, you'd say, was it more Aramaic or Hebrew?
In Jesus' time, Hebrew was gone as a spoken language among ordinary people by Jesus' time.
Only in synagogues, right? When they were
only
reading
learned males used it, and since they learned it so well, they could probably speak it. How much they bothered to speak it on non-theological topics is an unknown. But as the language had disappeared from the female population completely, I don't know of any stories about women learning Hebrew around the time of Jesus. I'm sure there was a learned rabbi who taught his daughter some Hebrew, but there's no record of it.
But when do you think that shift happened in Jewish population?
It took several centuries. Aramaic info. Well, let me defer it because I have a slide and some language to deliver on that. If I focus on what Jesus spoke and what his contemporaries spoke, I have a fair amount to say. because it's a very interesting topic.
Sure.
Now, that, by the way, is Ashurbanipal in this slide. Ashurbanipal II, the great Assyrian king. Now, here's a picture of the Persian Empire. I found it on the web, like most of these things. So you can see different reaches of the Persian Empire under Cyrus II, Cambyses II, and Darius I. And this was the largest history in date. Under Darius, he died in 486. This is all the way to Afghanistan. This is, a third of the way across North Africa, extending a little bit into the Arabian Peninsula. I'll talk about the role of Aramaic even reached into the Arabian Peninsula at one point in its lifetime. Now, the Persian Empire rose under the Achaemenid dynasty. That was in the 6th century BCE. This is the familiar dynasty of Darius, Xerxes et al. The Greeks knew all about. They were their great opponents. It displaced the Neo-Assyrian one that I spoke about previously and became the largest empire to date in history. Now, the Achaemenids continued the language policy of their Neo-Assyrian predecessors. They adopted Aramaic as the principal language for official business. Their own native language, known to scholars as Old Persian, never spread beyond its original homeland on the Iranian plateau. They used Aramaic to govern the empire and to standardize governmental processes over an enormous geographical area to a level never achieved in the Middle East before. I can't speak for China. It may have been the first time in world history that this level of control came to exist. Language standardization was part of this, so much so that the standard scholarly name for this stage of Aramaic is Imperial Aramaic. It was used for governmental communications all the way from Egypt to Afghanistan, and an unimaginable distance at the time. This did make Aramaic a truly world language. Again, that's a term I get from Gazella, the leading Aramaicist at the moment. But Aramaic was not used by the Achaemenids for all purposes. Royal inscriptions were still in their own language. In his famous inscription on the cliffside in Behistun in Persia, Darius used Elamite, Old Persian, and Babylonian to inscribe what he had to say. Now, Old Persian was his native language, presumably. Babylonian, the Persians recognized as a high cultural language with a great literary tradition. So he used that. He used Elamite, which is something of a puzzle, but it's not so much of a puzzle. But because Elamite was the only language on the Iranian plateau that had its own literary tradition. It was also a prestige language. What Darius didn't do, he did not employ Aramaic in this inscription. Again, Aramaic was the workaday, unglamorous language, and he just probably didn't even know it. Darius. We don't know if the nobles ever bothered to learn it at this time. So by contrast, as I said, Aramaic was used for everything in the bureaucracy, and the Persians developed this to an extent never previously achieved by anybody. We don't really know how it happened. The greater mystery, somehow at some point it jumped beyond this formal governmental context. It gradually became the primary written and oral means of communication within the various people in the Persian Empire, and at some point became the dominant language of the Near East. Not so much beyond the Near East, but we can see this indirectly by just considering the Aramaic influence on Akkadian. Remember, Akkadian is in Mesopotamia, which is right around here. It's a very abstract map. We can consider the Aramaic influence on Akkadian in Mesopotamia. Akkadian in the Achaemenid period starts using Aramaic loanwords in the realms of function words. They would substitute an Aramaic preposition for their own native preposition, and they're like very basic words and other basic vocabulary. Now, the influence goes the other way from Akkadian to Aramaic. The borrowings are limited to technical terms from the administrative, legal, artisanal, architectural, and religious areas. This indicates that Aramaic was increasingly the common people's everyday language, because Aramaic was changing the basic structure of Akkadian, while Akkadian was increasingly restricted to the educated and literate sections of society. scholars today estimate that Akkadian had become a purely literary and administrative medium by the end of the 6th century BCE and was replaced in general use by Aramaic. Now let's consider the effect of Aramaic spread under the aegis of two successive empires. By the way, how much time do we have left? I left
Oh,
my...
you can go as much as you want, John. I mean,
Okay, where are we now?
With
we are
22 minutes before.
yeah.
20 before 2?
Yeah, 22 before.
I mean, you know what? We can always, it's up to you. We can go as much as you want, but
Oh, I can finish. I have about a third to go. So I prefer to finish it then,
okay, no problem.
because I think it may go 2.5 hours.
No problem.
There's been so much audience participation. I'm very grateful.
No. Can I just add something quickly?
Yes.
And then also a question. So John had mentioned Behistun inscription by Persian.
Yeah, I should have had a picture of it. I'm sorry.
I know. But just to show the importance. So what it was is he basically kept his army for almost 2 months. An inscription was on the top of the mountain, and it basically depicted or had written about his conquest throughout Mesopotamia and even going into the land of Anatolia. And the most important thing is that his army, he wouldn't move them for 2 months until they finish the writing, and that's why it was so important.
Oh, it's just there's some photographs that exist of the archaeologist Henry Rawlinson, who would climb high up on this cliff face, hundreds of feet, just to copy, and it's astonishing. He'd be on a very, very narrow plank, and with no safety supports at all, and he would just be copying this inscription. You can imagine what the original scribes had to put up with, and did they suffer any deaths?
Yeah, well, that's another thing, right? I mean, you have the army stationed for 2 months doing nothing, and
Yeah,
discontent, there could be mutiny, and none of that happened, because just to show how glorious the Darius, particularly was king of kings, they call him, or a king close to God.
yeah, Shah.
And certainly
Shahun Shah.
Yeah.
that this was like a Rosetta Stone for hieroglyphs.
Oh, I was going to make that.
Oh,
I was
I'm
going
sorry.
to make. I was going to make that exact same point, Greg. Is that the fact that they used Babylonian for the third language was a big help in deciphering Akkadian. But anyway, generally you need a bilingual or a trilingual to decipher an unknown language. Sometimes you can get away without that, but anyway, now let's turn to another area of Aramaic's impact. We've considered the effect of Aramaic spread under the Neo-Assyrian and the Achaemenids. Now, I'm leaving out, there was a third empire that occurred between the Neo-Assyrians and the Achaemenids, and I'll come back to them later, the Neo-Babylonians, because that's connected to the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. Now, for now, though, I'm going to concentrate on Hebrew at this time, as it was still the language of the Jews. At that time, it was just the language of a small kingdom, never really got much of anywhere politically, never did. It was coexisting along with the many other languages in the area. There's a very interesting story in the Bible concerning Aramaic and Hebrew. This is in 2 Kings chapter 18, verses 17 to 37. At the time of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem in the year 701 BCE, this is when the Assyrians under Sennacherib, the famous king, were doing their conquering thing in 701 BCE. During the siege, the Judean officials and their Assyrian equivalents agreed to conduct public negotiations. The officials of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, wanted to conduct them in Aramaic so that the populace listening in wouldn't get worried about the state of the siege. At the time, even though Hezekiah eventually won and Sennacherib had to withdraw, at the time, things weren't looking very good for the Judeans. Now, whatever the truth of that story, you can see from this that both it assumes that both the Assyrian and Judean officials were competent in Aramaic, but that the Judean people would only know Hebrew. Now, this is well before the period 701 BC. It's well before Aramaic heavily infiltrated Judea. It assumes that Judean people would only know Hebrew, but as the Assyrians thought they were on the verge of winning, the Assyrian envoy read out Sennacherib's triumphant message in Hebrew with the purpose of making the people turn on their own king, Hezekiah. So this, whatever the factual matter is about the story, it does reflect accurately the likely linguistic situation. It's perfectly plausible that educated people in the Assyrian army and the Judean army or the administration or whoever these officials were, would have known Aramaic because it was the official language of the Achaemenid Empire, of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at the time. But the common people of Jerusalem would not, since 701 BC is well before they would have been exposed to Aramaic. But you can derive a lot from even stories that may be false if you look attention to the various aspects. Now, to go back, that's a picture of the poor inhabitants of Jerusalem being marched off to Babylon. It's a Victorian age picture, which caught my fancy. But just before the Persians came along, the Babylonians, the southern neighbor of Assyria, rose to power after rebelling against Assyrian dominance. This meant the end of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and it ushered in what scholars call the Neo-Babylonian period. Now, this only lasted from 612 through 539 BCE and did not change much in administrative practice or the language policy. They continued with Aramaic. But it did mean catastrophe for the kingdom of Judah. Nebuchadnezzar, the famous Neo-Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar II, besieged Jerusalem and conquered it. Traditionally stated, I discovered by looking at Wikipedia yesterday, I thought the date of the Babylonian captivity was 586, but now they consider it to be 597 BC. I don't know what the reasons were for people to make this change, but that's the way it is. That's a big switch in the first millennium, almost over 10 years, actually. This meant the end of the David's dynasty, the Davidic dynasty. It meant the destruction of the first temple, which was the center of Israelite worship at the time, and the deportation of what people think are just the upper class to Mesopotamia. Not all the Jews went to Mesopotamia, just the upper class, the influential ones, and this was the famous Babylonian exile. After the Babylonian conquest, archaeological finds in the area does show a sharp decrease in population of about 70% in Judea. Not until Persian times, the good King Cyrus, was in the eyes of the Jews, not until Persian times was there any large-scale resettlements in the cities. Many of the immigrants must have spoken Aramaic, which was already the dominant spoken language of all of Syria and Mesopotamia by this time. So basically the social and cultural situation of Judeans in the Babylonian exile when they were in Nineveh, the Assyrian city, maybe scattered around, it's still barely understood. We do know that some of the Jews got access to Akkadian, to Babylonian culture because, there's a great similarity between the story of Nozak and equivalent story in the Gilgamesh epic about the gods of God getting angry at humanity and deciding to destroy them, but he decides to save the one righteous man, Noah, in the Hebrew tradition. So he builds an ark and that unfolds, but the Jews clearly derived it from a Babylonian original, which was distinctly older than anything in the Bible. So it's been suggested that the Jews learned about that story in Assyria, and they would have been exposed to Babylonian culture in some way, but we don't have any information on that. What people do think is that during the Babylonian exile, the people who had been deported stopped speaking Hebrew in Babylonia. I don't know how strong the evidence is to that, but there seems to be a consensus. Again, as a learned language spoken by learned rabbis, Hebrew would have continued, but the deportees would have, they were there for almost 100 years, I believe. there would have been several generations, and their children could well have switched to the other language, grew up, and then Hebrew would have been forgotten. But we really don't know much about that. I like the picture anyway. I'd never seen it before. Now that's Daniel on the lion's den. I picked the most ridiculous depiction of that I could find. Looks kind of Victorian. The lions all have interesting expressions, but anyway. Now after we're going through, successive empires here. First you had the Neo-Assyrian, then the Achaemenids took over the Persian. First you had the Neo-Assyrians, then you had the Neo-Babylonians, and the Achaemenids took over. That runs through several centuries. But, then Alexander the Great came along in the 4th century, and he put pay to the Persian Empire. He ended it in the famous defeat of Darius. Darius, I forget which number he has. In the Persian Empire, that would have been late 4th century. Alexander died in 323, so it was sometime before that. So, the writing tradition that the Achaemenids used, and which developed earlier, it's called Imperial Aramaic. As I said, it did not die out with the end of the with the Achaemenids. Now, when the Macedonians, who spoke a form of Greek, took over their place, they spread Greek around. But Imperial Aramaic didn't die out, as you might have expected. It took on a life of its own. Something very close to Imperial Aramaic was used in the Aramaic sections of the books of Ezra and Daniel in the Bible. It's a strange fact. It's a very strange fact in the Bible that as you start reading the book of Daniel in Hebrew, it suddenly switches to Aramaic without warning. So that suggests that bilingualism among the people who wrote or compiled or edited the book of Daniel, it must have been so strong among the drafters of the Bible that they saw no problem with this. Just start off in Hebrew and switch to Aramaic. Everybody understands it. As an aside, I had a Hebrew teacher once who, while we were working our way through Daniel in Hebrew, he decided to keep going through the Aramaic portion, even though the course was supposedly devoted to Hebrew. I guess his justification was along the lines of, hey, they're close enough. But it was quite frustrating for the students who hadn't actually studied any Aramaic at the time. They had to get their grammars out. Oh, by the way, Daniel is considered the latest book of the Bible, based mainly on content and linguistic evidence. Its composition is dated to about circa 170 BCE. And I don't know the details behind that as to why they date it like that. I'm not an Old Testament scholar. But it seems to be it does seem to be the scholarly consensus. That's considered a firm fact. Now, Judea would have been completely Aramaicized by now. So in addition, what we think of today as the Hebrew script, the so-called square script, I mentioned it before, used not just for Hebrew today, but also earlier for Yiddish and Ladino. Ladino is a Judaized form of Spanish, is actually derived from the Imperial Aramaic script used in the Achaemenid Empire. There was an older Jewish script that ceased being used. Such was the prestige of Aramaic, that the Jews gave up their original script in favor of it. In general, Hebrew and Aramaic and Jewish culture at the time were complementary in what they were used for. Hebrew was used for religious law, poetry, and national history, and that's what the Hebrew Bible mostly contains. While Aramaic, as it was elsewhere, was increasingly the daily workaday language of everyone, which isn't quite true. I don't go into it in this talk, but Aramaic was used extensively in writing by Jews. Most famous reflection is the Babylonian Talmud, which was composed in Mesopotamia early in the Christian era, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, somewhere in there. And you see an amazing mix of Hebrew and Aramaic in the Babylonian Talmud. They keep constantly switching back and forth. It was a highly bilingual culture. Even they didn't, if they used Hebrew, they didn't use it exclusively. In fact, the Talmud gives the impression of being written reports of actual oral debates. I mean, I remember studying it. It was quite striking. I haven't looked at it in a long time, though. Well, in subsequent years, Aramaic must also have spread through Judea to such a degree that, as I said, Hebrew had become a dead language by the 2nd century at the latest. Although it was still in use as a religious and cultural system with a holy status, it's always called the Lashon HaKodesh. the holy language, the language of holiness. It was no longer naturally, just put on technical grounds, Hebrew was no longer naturally acquired by children as a first language just by listening to their parents and other children. That doesn't mean that the occasional religious scholar didn't ensure that his male children didn't acquire a high degree of competence in the language from their earliest years. It just means that Hebrew vanished from the general community, particularly from the women. There's no evidence of a Hebrew-speaking woman after a certain date. Aramaic rules supreme. Now, I could follow many threads here, but to close this out, I'm going to follow just two, because Aramaic had influence all over Eurasia for many centuries. But what I'm going to concentrate on is the influence, some of these threads rather, there's as you go on, as the books in the Bible become younger, as you go through the Bible, the language in the books look increasingly Aramaicized. They begin to look more like Aramaic, the Hebrew. Now, Syriac is a variant of Aramaic that in the Christian era became the main ecclesiastical and theological language of the Eastern Christian churches. Up to this day, it reached into Central Asia and even China through missionary activity. In fact, the national script of Mongolia is the Syriac script, which is kind of hard to believe, but it's true. But today, I'm not going to discuss those topics in depth. I'll just do two. One is the role of Aramaic in the New Testament, and the Christian portion of the Bible, and the impact of Aramaic on Arabic, the language that replaced it as the dominant language of the Near East. On the first topic, the New Testament was written entirely in Greek, except for a few Aramaic phrases. Many scholars since the 19th century have argued that there were earlier Aramaic versions of the Gospels, but no such documents have been found, and so there really is no evidence for the existence of a written Aramaic Gospel. But Gospels have been produced in Aramaic later, but they were themselves translations from the original Greek. The plain fact is that the constructions and expressions in New Testament Greek that do not match the well-studied rules of classical Greek can often not be exclusively attributed to Aramaic or Hebrew influence. The same constructions and expressions occur in everyday Greek found in papyri of the time, where they would have written contracts and things like that. The Greek of the New Testament also consciously imitates the narrative style of the Septuagint, which was that was the Greek translation made of the Hebrew Bible. It was made in Egypt for the Jews who were living there in the 3rd century BCE. Apparently, they were losing their Hebrew. The elders of the community felt they needed a version in Greek, which was the official language of Egypt at the time, because of the Ptolemies, and Cleopatra was a member of a Macedonian dynasty. But Greek was a very important language in Egypt. Now, the Septuagint even coins expressions to match what's found in the Hebrew original, e.g. the Greek expression kai ageneto, and in English it came to pass. That's one of the most familiar biblical and characteristic biblical turns of phrases in the Bible. That's based on a Hebrew original, Vayhi, but the Septuagint just created that, copying the Hebrew. That means that anything that kind of looks like Aramaic or Hebrew in the New Testament may just be an imitation of what's in the Septuagint. We just don't know. Now, all this doesn't mean the claim that there was no written Aramaic gospel preceding the Greek gospels. The lack of a gospel manuscript in Aramaic doesn't mean that the writers of the Greek New Testament were not familiar with all traditions about Jesus. The fact that he occasionally speaks in Aramaic in the New Testament seemed to indicate that there had been oral material that informed what went into the Greek written version. Now, I won't get into the questions of analysis of the New Testament and its textual history. I'll limit myself to the more linguistic aspects of what Jesus may have spoken. This would not have been something like Imperial Aramaic. Jesus was from Galilee, a district north of Jerusalem. He would have spoken a form of Aramaic that probably sounded odd and distinctive to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. How do we know this? Well, when Jesus had been arrested and was about to be crucified, we find the following passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 69 to 73. Quote, "Now Peter, he was the lead apostle, was sitting outside in the courtyard of the high priest, who was interrogating Jesus at the time. And a servant girl came to him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But he denied it before all of them, saying, "I do not know what you are talking about." When he went out to the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." End quote. Now, unfortunately, we don't know anything about the phonetic differences between Galilean Aramaic and the Aramaic of Jerusalem, but there was a difference, as the story indicates. And given the undoubted linguistic snobbishness of the people of Jerusalem, as their city was the center of the Jewish religion, that's where the temple was, and there was only one temple where sacrifice could be performed at the time. This was before Judaism Judaism is usually restricted to the period after the destruction of the second temple, the term, I mean. So the fact that Jesus spoke with a rustic hick accent was probably a big strike against him in the eyes of the people of Jerusalem. He spoke like an ignorant Galilean. So there are also Aramaic words found here and there in the New Testament. For example, Golgotha, place of the skull, that's where Jesus was crucified. That's an Aramaic word. It's an Aramaic form. That suffix THA is characteristically Aramaic. It's not found in Hebrew. And also there's another word, Akeldama, which translates as field of blood. And I believe that's where Judas was buried. And there's a gruesome story about, as retribution for his betrayal of Jesus. In one of the Gospels, his abdomen bursts open spontaneously and he dies. And he gets buried in the Akeldama, field of blood. Now, and that final A in Dama is also an Aramaic suffix, not found in Hebrew. Now, another odd fact about these names is that the Greek text often identifies them as Hebraisti, the Greek name for Hebrew. This is largely, they're saying that what's actually Aramaic is Hebrew. They'll say it in the text. This is largely because Hebrew and Aramaic look a lot alike. The most prominent difference, as I said, Hebrew has a definite article, which is prefix, stuck on the front, and Aramaic shows a suffix with the same function. They were written with the same script in Judea and were both important languages of Judaism. Plus, the New Testament was written for an international audience. That's one of the great developments in Christianity, as you're probably aware, is that originally Christianity was just another Jewish sect. Jesus of Nazareth thought of himself as a Jewish rabbi. The great Hungarian scholar Gezer of Hermes sort of established this 50 years ago. So for the audience, the New Testament was being written, the distinction between the two languages may have been irrelevant. So when we find Hebraisti in the New Testament, meaning Hebrew, introducing an Aramaic word, it may just have meant in the local language.
John,
Yes.
John, I have a question. So how well spread Greek language was in, let's say, Syria and Palestine?
Oh, I don't get into that, but evidently Greek is an interesting imperial language because it spreads so quickly, and it was established most firmly in Egypt, I believe, because it continued for many centuries. But the interesting feature about Greek is that it retreated completely after the expansion of Alexander all the way to Afghanistan, where they established Greek cities even. It retreated completely back to its homeland, which means it was never rooted very deeply. And it's usually assumed that Greek would have been known by the elites, but not too many people in the lower classes would have. They just stuck with their native languages. So it was rather in a rather fragile situation, except in Egypt. That seemed to have been strong.
But then the empire, it was not the case. Right?
Excuse me, I didn't hear that.
Seleucid Empire,
yeah, up in Syria,
it was not the case.
After Alexander, his generals divided up his empire amongst themselves, and they named the portions of the empire after themselves. General Seleucus got Syria farther north, and the Ptolemies, named after Ptolemy, got Egypt, and there was a third one which escapes me.
but you're saying that yeah, very well, Macedonian. But you're saying that in Seleucid Empire, even whatever left of her in Syria and Palestine, the Greek was not as
No,
established. Right?
it retreated quickly. It's odd when you can compare it with Rome.
So the
Rome
fact,
was a Latin survived the collapse of the Roman Empire on the left, and then the usual thinking is that the Roman practice of rewarding their armies with land in the provinces and causing them to relocate there may have had a lot to do with it. I don't know the details of how the Greeks handled how the Macedonians handled their empire, but I don't think they concentrated on building cities and didn't do much. It may just simply have been a lack of Greek. They didn't have the necessary amount of Greek speakers to sort of roll over the other languages. It may just
so I just wanted to say that the fact that Gospels were written in Greek and would targeted the audience were Greek is kind of like probably supporting the idea that was written more kind of towards the end of the first century AD, and they were not even interested to target Jewish or population at the time.
Yeah, it's Christianity became as a Jewish sect, one among several. Right. And then over the course of the centuries, you see a split coming. And by the end of the century, the amount of you can see the growth of anti-Semitism in the Gospels themselves. It just gets worse and worse, even though it was still Jew. And there was the famous debate, which was recorded in Acts of the Apostles, and I'm no New Testament scholar, between Peter. Paul wanted you could be a good Christian without following the Jewish law, and Peter disagreed. And Paul essentially won that battle. Christians did not have to be circumcised, and Paul was the great entrepreneur in this situation. He traveled all over the Mediterranean. He even made it to Arabia, and he was proselytizing. And it's usually claimed Jesus may have been the founder, but it was Paul that got the thing going. And the decision to do the New Testament in Greek was probably because it was an international language in Aramaic, and at the time, outside of the Near East, Aramaic was not perceived as a worthy language. So they made a decision with their projected audience in view. But Aramaic was a strong Christian language too, but only in the East.
Right, but the main thing is that there is a lot of discussion and controversy about the authorship of the Gospels.
Yeah,
because the scientists, the historians, they believe that they weren't written by the original traditional the disciples of Jesus, that they were written by someone else by a similar name. That's and tradition kind of often relates to that the Gospel of John was written by the John who was the disciple of Jesus, things like that. That would have been earlier. But the fact that it was written in Greek, most likely disciples of Jesus probably didn't know Greek and then were not even literate.
Well, the level of Greek knowledge varies in the New Testament quite a bit. Luke is considered the Gospel of Luke, whoever Luke was, the Greek is high quality. Was clearly a person educated in the Greek classics. Probably the worst Greek is the Book of Revelation, where the writer John of Patmos, who may or may not have been the same as the John who wrote the Gospel.
The one who wrote the Apocalypse, right? The one who wrote
the Apocalypse, the last book of the Bible. His Greek is quite poor. Even has grammatical mistakes. So the levels of who these people were is very unclear. I saw an article recently. I never thought of it before. It seems so obvious, but the four Gospels are filled with internal inconsistencies among each other. The Christ whipping the the tax collectors out of the temple occurs right before the crucifixion in one of the Gospels, and another Gospel that occurs quite much earlier in his 3-year career. And there's all these sorts of inconsistencies which suggest whoever composed the Gospels, they weren't trying to smooth it and make it internally consistent, which sort of increases the authenticity of each of the Gospels, because if you think of them as memories, then of course there are going to be inconsistencies over several generations. I mean, that would be expected. I know in the early church, the Gospel of Mark was considered to be reminiscences of Peter as dictated to somebody else. But I was just approached, I'm not a New Testament scholar, so my knowledge is limited, but I was going at it from the linguistic angle is whoever put the Gospels together, they had access to Aramaic oral traditions because of these phrases occurring. And if they believe, and it makes sense, the last words of Jesus on the cross would be considered quite sacred, and they could easily have been left in Aramaic for exactly that reason. And it's quite possible, even probable, that no, there's two extremes here. You can take the Gospels literally in every respect. You have the problem of the internal inconsistencies, because you have direct contradictions. On the other hand, you can say Christ is a figure created by somebody about 100 AD, and they wrote everything looking backwards. And would they really have written something as filled with inconsistencies as they did? As you know, it's all very. I'm agnostic on the question, but
John, we've been taking questions from the meetup, but we also have questions from YouTube. Something new. But so there's this person, Jocelyn Torres, and I really can't make out the question, but let me read it. Camel was introduced in Canaan in the 10th century BC. The Aramaic alphabet is from the 20th century BC, which is, the letter Gimel and Gamel was named after the 10th BC, or something is wrong with that camel chronology. Something is wrong with this chronology.
yeah, the camel was introduced late. They're right about that. We don't know when. It's in Phoenicia that I believe that the names of the letters were introduced, and that would have been after the 10th century BC. It would have been 8th or 9th. So it is consistent with the introduction of the camel to some extent. But no, it is true the camel. They rode mules or donkeys around in the patriarchal age, and in the book of Genesis, there aren't any camels. That is true. But Gimel is generally related to camel. That's true.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
But those names may be fairly young. They first show up in the Phoenician period, I believe, which is in beginning of the first millennium.
Right. So this was always kind of like haunting me, as a Jew. When my father died, I read the famous, a prayer Kaddish, in honor of my father, and then they told me that's not in Hebrew, that's in Aramaic.
Yes.
So a lot of it, I speak a little bit of Hebrew, so a lot of it didn't make sense to me. It was hard kind of to memorize, and if there was a 40 rabbis, they will read it in four different ways. It's they say Ishkadar, Idkadar, like you say it, and then they'll say, oh, you don't say Ishkadar, you say Wishkadar, like they would.
Yeah.
These sounds are so different from, like, if you go to Moroccan, which is the Sephardic Jewish wave, they say it one way. Then Ashkenazi, they say Eid Kadal, so it's
yeah.
So I had a hard difficulty, not learning it. I mean, obviously it's all there. There's a million videos and you can kind of learn it and say it. But whenever you say a word incorrectly, obviously, religiously people say, oh, your father's soul doesn't ascend high enough. So in Hebrew, in a lot of the prayers, Jewish prayers, there's a combination of the Aramaic and Hebrew.
That's true. That's true. Chad Gadya too. I read it before this talk, and there's a lot of Hebrew in there. It's not completely in Aramaic, so that just shows people are highly bilingual. They can switch back and forth at will, which they do. Begin one sentence in Hebrew and finish it in Aramaic.
So to me, it's interesting that one of the aspects. Okay, so they interpret it in so different ways. So the fact that Aramaic is also had been spoken language for so long, a lot of the sounds must have gone, because like I said, 40 rabbis interpreted different 40 ways. And it's the sounds are so much different. And it makes, like religiously, I'm not as religious. It makes people like tick when you don't say the correct way.
Yeah, well, some people are quite sticklers for accurate, correct language.
So, and also another question I have, though the Cyrus cylinder and Ashurbanipal library, what was the
Yes.
percentage of Semitic, Aramaic, and maybe even Hebrew writing? I don't know. What would you say? Like whatever survived. Like for example, Cyrus cylinder, was it all written in Aramaic? Was it not? I mean, how it?
Actually, I don't know, to tell you the truth. I know about the Cyrus cylinder. I've never read it though, so
I see.
I
Okay.
don't know what it's written.
What about the famous,
I think
eye
I
for
think
an
I,
eye, and
excuse me?
eye for an eye. What's his name? The laws of Hammurabi. Uh,
That's in Akkadian,
Akkadian. Got it.
in
Okay.
Babylonian. There was a later Assyrian. Babylonian and Akkadian are two different dialects. They were mutually comprehensible. They aren't very different, but they not too much Aramaic literature outside of the Syriac outside of the Christian churches of the East, the Orthodox churches, the Assyrian church, the Melkites, the Jacobites, all of that, which produced a ton of religious literature in Aramaic, a ton, which I haven't gone into today because we'd be here for another 2 hours. And the Jewish use of Aramaic, as I alluded to, the use in the Midrashim and the Talmuds, particularly the Babylonian Talmud, there's a lot of Aramaic that shows up. What you don't have anywhere in Aramaic is very much creative literature, where they tell a story, as in the Bible. You do have something called the Tale of Achika, which was apparently written in Aramaic, but that's the only real work of literature that I'm really aware of. There were also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a fair amount of Aramaic, which I have looked at. And what they would do is the most famous Aramaic composition is the Genesis Apocryphon, which is sort of an elaboration of the tales in the patriarchal tales in Aramaic, and it just provides a lot more detail about, imagined detail about what was going on. And they provide a famous description of how beautiful Sarah was, which is not in the Bible, but it is in this Dead Sea Scroll written in Aramaic called the Genesis Apocryphon. And it's apocryphal because it's, something added to the Bible, but it's in Aramaic. But it never, whatever, they did have a little bit of literature, but none of it really, got any really didn't get out of the Aramaic community to any great extent. Unlike Hebrew, which became, the Old Testament became the most important book in the Western world. But anyway, I have one more, I promise, one more thing. I just want to talk about, before closing, I'd like to talk about the impact of Aramaic on Arabic. Now, as we've said, we've talked about the impact of Aramaic on Syria, Palestine, the Assyrian Empire, Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, and Judea. So it had impacts in other places, but I don't have time. So Aramaic also had a big impact on Arabic. The Arabian Peninsula lies beyond the area where Aramaic spread as a naturally spoken language. Yet the history of Aramaic is inextricably linked to Arabia, since in Achaemenid times, Imperial Aramaic was introduced into Arabia as a means of formal expression for law and probably also administration. This then developed into what is called Nabatean Aramaic. The Nabatean Empire was founded in the 4th century and survived until its conquest by the Romans in 106 AD. It controlled I forgot to switch slides there. It controlled the major trade routes between East and West. So this was the best slide I could find. This is the the approximate boundary of the Nabatean Empire at its head. Its capital was the famous city carved in stone in Petra, which I'm sure some of you have been to. I have never been, but it was called Nabatea, the empire. I'm not sure if the etymology is known. Now, the importance of Nabatea, basically it controlled the major trade routes between East and West and rose to control a fair amount of territory too, as you can see, a big chunk. This is in the Arabian Peninsula, and this is in the southern Palestine area. Now, what's interesting, the written formal language may have been Imperial Aramaic, but the population definitely spoke Arabic at the time, a form of Arabic, not the Arabic we know as represented in classical Arabic, but something that's not too far from it. So consequently, we see a lot of Arabic influence on the Imperial Aramaic. Perhaps most important for the influence of Aramaic on Arabic, it was the Nabatean Aramaic letter shapes, and I should have included a picture of them. They became the ultimate basis for the lovely flowing cursive Arabic script that continues to this day. The Nabatean its script was itself cursive, and that means the letters run together. If you notice in the older scripts, the Phoenician and the Old Aramaic, they don't run together, and the Hebrew doesn't run together in the printed version. It doesn't run together in the printed version. So a cursiveness of writing seems to have been introduced when they switched to soft materials like papyrus, where you could get a very high rate of speed from writing cursively. So it seems that Aramaic is responsible for the Arabic alphabet as we know it. So I'll end at this point. I won't be discussing the displacement of Aramaic by Arabic with the rise of Islam. We did discuss it a little bit. It ran over several centuries at different rates in different areas, but eventually Arabic won out for the most part. So essentially the reason for this was the more normal reason in history. Arabic was the language of the conquerors. In order to function successfully in society, non-Arabic speakers gradually adapted by learning Arabic. Now, the other question, to what extent the imperfect acquisition of Arabic by these new speakers may have influenced Arabic is unknown. You know that children learn you learn a second language, say English, and you speak it imperfectly, your children will tend to pick up your speaking habits, speaking a new version of English. When you die off and your children become adults, that will become their grammar. If there are enough people like that in a society, then it will change the shape of the language. It's the transmission between generations is critical. We don't know when people speaking Aramaic and the other Near Eastern languages switch to Arabic, we don't know how it influenced Arabic, but some scholars do think that spoken Arabic dialects, which look a lot like Aramaic in many respects, spoken Arabic dialects may show a lot of characteristics that go back to these Aramaic speakers. But the research in that area has really not been done. It's only a supposition, a guess at this point. And with that, I'll end the talk. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes, definitely. I mean, read the comments, John.
Okay.
They're very complimentary.
Thank you.
The last couple at the end. It's let's see. Any last questions? Anybody? I don't know. Zach, you wanna unmute everyone?
Yeah, sure. Let me unmute everyone. Sorry. Let me just do that right now. I can only ask to unmute everyone, and then you guys can go ahead and.
Yeah, if you wanna talk, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah. So I just asked everybody to unmute if you want, and then please raise your hand. So just keep it kind of like in the order. And I don't know how much, John, you have time. Maybe since it's such an interesting conversation, people will probably have many questions. Jean is the first one. Jean, go ahead.
Does that mean that Jesus could have been, part Arabic, even though he was born in Israel? I don't know if
No,
that's.
Arabic was restricted to the Arabian Peninsula at his time.
Oh, so he was
There
just
was a lot
Israel.
of, by Muhammad's time, there was a lot of commercial trading, commercial activity, training activity, and that. But that's part of the story of Muhammad, is how
And
much
Jesus
he was
spoke.
exposed to Aramaic. But Jesus was way
Oh,
too early to have made contact with Arabic.
but he spoke a little Arabic. Is that right?
No, he
Or
spoke Aramaic.
Aramaic? That's not.
Aramaic,
Oh, is that
yes.
similar to Arabic?
It's in the same language family. They're quite a bit different, though.
Oh, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, that's why Aramaic frequently gets confused with Arabic, but it was that one of the purposes of this talk was to sort of resurrect Aramaic. It was a very important language for 1,000 years, and it has shrunk considerably, even though there are communities speaking Aramaic to this day. It's a very different form of Aramaic today, but it is Aramaic. So, and well, one of the tragedies of the last 20 years has been, the Christians in the Near East have been under enormous pressure due to the rise of extremist Islamic groups and so on. But they're still there.
Last time we discussed when we did the modern Egypt, there's about 10% of the population of Egypt is Coptic Christians, and so we basically discussed the Copts' current environment, so to speak, in Egypt, and how Morsi is more accepting, of it than
Yeah, didn't he visit one of them? I know Sisi visited a Coptic church recently.
Sisi is more accepting, and then
Yeah,
keeps them, I guess, closer, and obviously had visited, as you said.
it's never discussed. I don't know the situation in detail, but I do know that the Egyptian government forbids the construction of new Coptic churches, and they won't publish the population statistics, even though people think it is around 10%, which is a big chunk, actually. But from a linguistic standpoint, Coptic is not Semitic. It's the last remaining descendant of ancient Egyptian, which is a relative of Semitic, but it's not in the same family. And I don't know if any Copts actually use it. It's still used in their religious ceremonies. That happens repeatedly in the Near East, is that languages start getting used in ecclesiastical situations, and that's about it. It dies out. It turns into something else as a spoken language, and the two diverge completely, which happens repeatedly.
Right. And anybody else, any questions? We have some questions here, but more like a political one. Wasn't there a Coptic church attacked a few years ago? Not just.
Yeah, there was. Not more recently than that, I thought. I saw it in the press.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm the one who asked the question. I just remember very vividly. I'm almost sure it was around this time of year, which was one reason why it was so shocking.
Right.
Yeah, it was quite bloody, as I recall.
Exactly.
But considering, how the whole thing started with two soccer clubs in Cairo, fans going head to head, and then obviously the spring started, and but it was just two soccer fans going at each other. So I guess it's all open. There's the fans of Malek and another club, I forget the name, and so it was more like Italians call them tifosi, the fans going at each other, and it all started this religious, kind of war, and then obviously with.
Yeah, we have to watch out for those sports events.
Yeah, I was not aware. Thank you, Zach. That's why I asked the question. I wasn't aware what was causing it, but I can't believe it could have started with a soccer match.
Oh yeah. It was,
I don't know. In the Byzantine Empire, the Emperor Justinian was almost brought down because of a fight between the two famous hippodrome factions, the Blues and the Greens, who were watching. This is in the 6th century.
I should recensor myself. It's not that I can't believe, it's that I have a really hard time living with that.
Yeah, well, maybe not in Cairo, because they don't. but alcohol is
neat.
associated with social events in large numbers of young males, so watch out.
Yeah, I that attribution does make sense. That Zach had made a remark along those lines a little while back. Yeah, it just seems so incredibly futile in a way to think that those things can develop in that way. I know I sound like a naive idiot, but it just is horrifying to me.
Well, if you go to like countries like, former Yugoslavia, the whole Baltic conflict happened and had been exasperated, obviously with, old wounds that they had, but most of it was a team versus team. So they had Dynamo Zagreb, versus, Crvena Zvezda of, Belgrade. And let me tell you, it was war. Okay. And if you go to the stadium, if you don't come out with at least a black eye, I don't know where it is. You go to Argentina and you watch Buenos Aires, River Plate playing some other team. It's like a war. I mean, it's only in the United States that sporting events are relatively very quiet. But
Yeah, they are.
I
I
can't.
know the British soccer hooligans are world famous.
Yeah, and that's they were at one point they were kicked out of European clubs competition because of their crazy behavior. They were just but that's and then one time they tried to go to Turkey where it was Leeds United played against Istanbul team, and they went British hooligans went to Turkey and they wanted to do this shenanigans and Turkish had none of it and 3 British fans got stabbed to death and that stopped it immediately.
So it's not exactly a good sign that so many
No.
Americans are starting to get so involved with soccer. Is that what you're trying to tell me?
Well, that's why it's called soccer here because we don't want to import.
That's a paradox. American football is so much more violent than football and the rest of the world soccer, but the American fans are much more pacific.
Yeah, Matt Damon.
Strange.
Matt Damon is married to his Argentinian wife. And he said one time I asked my father-in-law, in Buenos Aires, can we go see, Boca Juniors play in the stadium? And he's with hesitation. All right, I'll take you there. But they had to go through 3 different barricades to get to the to the stadium. And there was a fence around the where the people are playing because it almost always end up in a fight. Gang on gang, and then they have in between they have empty stadiums and the prime spaces. And so why there's empty seats? There's empty seats in between the 2 different factions. And so, you don't want to die, basically. That's why they want to have police want to have enough time to like separate them. I mean, this is how the world. They have Baltic conflict starting with that. And then also famously, like for example, I know that if there's a parallels in like a Nazi Germany, the sporting events, obviously in 1936, we know Owen's story and, how Hitler wanted to show that, Germany won the most medals in 1936, actually, United States being the second, but they wanted to show that they're Aryan nation. And then when Max Schmachel fought, Joe Louis before the World War II, Joe Louis beat him. Once he lost and once he won. And then when Joe Louis, Africa, as an African American, came back to the United States, he died very poor. But Max Schmachel, who lost to Joe Louis, ended up having rights to Coca-Cola in Germany after the World War II. Even though he was not a Nazi supporter, but he had to fight for Nazi against the United States. He didn't die a poor man. He was rich. And he came and helped Joe Louis in the United States by giving him money and for him not to die poor. But Hitler, after he lost to Joe Louis, didn't even let him go into the army. He sent him to Russian front because he only sent people to Russian front if he didn't like you. So in that regard, United States treated the African American worse than obviously Germany had treated even the Nazi sympathizer who fought for Nazis against an American. That was just something out of control, basically. There's a lot of stories about that stuff.
That was Jesse Owens that defeated
No, Joe Louis.
No, but I
No,
mean,
Jesse Owens was he
the
was
Olympic
runner.
runner.
he was a runner, he was a long jumper, and then there's a great movie about it. That was recently shot, like 10 years ago.
I think it's called Race. And I agree, it is a great movie.
Oh my
yeah.
God, it was a great movie. And
It disappeared. It's one of those movies that's really, really good, but I don't think anybody watched it.
where the German runner, German long
Yeah,
jump, let told Jesse Owens basically how to jump because he kept missing the mark before.
yeah.
So he helped him, to jump from the correct mark so he can win the Olympic gold medal. And obviously Hitler didn't like that. That why is a Germany guy who is about to win the medal is helping an American to win,
Hmm.
and then Hitler wouldn't obviously shake his hand because he was African American.
Right.
Hmm.
You said the name of that movie was Race?
Yeah.
I just, I need to go. I just wanted to thank you, John, for a
Oh,
wonderful
thank
presentation.
you, Greg. Thank
Enjoyed
you
it
for listening.
tremendously. A lot of, so it was great. So, goodbye,
I
everybody. We gotta
yeah.
move on.
Thanks for all your help, Greg.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you.
Sure.
All right.
Bye.
All right. I guess at this point, John, just let me know about the next language, and we can.
Yeah, I have to think about seeing what resources I need.
Sure, I understand.
I know a lot about some of these languages, not so much about others, so that sort of drives my selections for obvious reasons.
I get it. I mean, we did quite a lot with Latin language. We can even do, I don't know if it's closer to you, also kind of morphing German morphing into more British, with the,
Oh, if you want to hear about that I know a fair amount about.
yeah, Saxon.
Yeah, I can do that. Let me think about it.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely we're suckers for this type of stuff.
Yeah, I thought Aramaic was a poor selection. I'm glad you suggested. It turns out it's a fascinating language. I think one of the reasons it's relatively little known is that its study is split among different fields, like the Old Testament people.
Right.
Old Testament scholars, they know the book of Daniel, they have to know something about Aramaic, but they don't pay any attention to the Eastern churches, the Syriac speakers, and it's just scattered so much, and there's no I don't think there's a Department of Aramaic Studies anywhere in the United States or anywhere.
Now, the Maronites and historians, they spoke also a form of Aramaic, or
Who did? I didn't catch.
Maronite Church.
Yeah, that's a form of Aramaic, yes.
Okay, got it.
It's always very confusing to me that they seem to have hundreds of churches in the Middle East, Christian churches, and they all have different names, but I've been to a Maronite mass, and they do use Aramaic.
Nestorian Church, have you heard of?
That's Eastern, yeah, that's more, that was a Nestorius, their founder, was considered a heretic, so he had to flee town, and he went east to Persia.
Right.
And that's another whole branch of the Eastern churches.
Well, famously, one of the sons of Genghis Khan was a Nestorian Christian. So when they were attacking, particularly Baghdad and all the,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Umayyad, obviously converted, Umayyad conclave. They said all these evil Christians are attacking sanctuaries of. That was
one of the strangest facts about Aramaic. I don't think I mentioned it. It just popped into my head. Is that maybe I did. The basis of the Mongolian script is actually Syriac.
That's right.
To this day, they did a lot of missionary work in the East. They converted a lot of people along the Silk Road, actually. So.
Yeah, I mean,
right into China. So
thinking about it, the Genghis Khan and his hordes cleaned up a lot of the act on the Silk Road. That was a mess prior to Genghis Khan attack. Obviously, he killed a lot of people. They killed someone. They saying right now, this is not related to him killing, but someone they say 1/10 of the people can relate in the Asia to Genghis Khan or something like that, to his DNA. Somewhere about 250 million people, because he had so many children and all that stuff.
I have seen the same statement that he had many progeny.
Well, Ralph has a question. Ralph, go ahead.
Just a comment. Yeah, I've studied a little bit about the expansion of the alphabet, and I think, as you say, it started with Proto-Sinaitic and Proto-Canaanite. I think are different names for the
Yeah.
same thing. People have studied Canaan, call it Proto-Canaanite. People have studied the Sinai, but that gave rise to Phoenician, and then from Phoenician, the alphabet went west to Greece, and then to Russia and Rome and everywhere else in Europe. And it also independently went east to Aramaic. And from Aramaic, it spread throughout Asia. So it went from Syriac, I guess it was used in some parts of Persia or Iran, and up to, I guess, Uzbekistan, and then Tajikistan and Mongolia, and I think it was, and even to Manchu. And then it also spread, I think, the Indian Brahmic alphabet, which is I guess fairly different than Aramaic, but is thought to derive from, or at least be inspired by, Aramaic.
Yeah.
So all of those Asian alphabets, and of course you don't get to China or Japan, but up to, I think, Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, to Mongolia and Manchuria and India. And then from India, that same writing system spread to Southeast Asia, to Thailand, Cambodia, and other places. And those are, I think those are all based on the Aramaic version of the alphabet from the Phoenician alphabet. Thanks.
Yeah. That's my understanding too. It was Aramaic was the descendant of the Phoenician. I showed the old Aramaic and the Phoenician slides, and they're really structurally and visually very similar. But it was Aramaic that sort of put the alphabet on the map in the East through missionary activity and trading activity.
So if there's no more questions, I want to thank John again for the excellent presentation. And then, we'll be in touch on our next, and you guys join us on the next presentation by John or Jason Peng, Richard, me, which is me and Beverly doing the, we'll just talk about it. Sumerian citizen 3,000 years ago, XO. We'll meet on the, hope John, you can join us.
When is it?
So we moved it to 29th. So let me just make sure. Sorry. So 29th at 12 p.m. That's Saturday, 12 p.m.
Okay. And this is a day in the life of a Sumerian citizen.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to talk about one citizen particularly, but Beverly is going to touch on the or as Jews call it, or not. And I'll talk about city Lavash. We're going to talk about this person. His name was Ur-Utu, who was the priest that his 40 tablets were found by a Belgian archaeologist. And we'll talk about how he lived, what contracts he had. So basically, assuming we'll talk about his religion. He'll talk about it's very detailed, so it's going to be really interesting, and we'll connect with.
Did you already send out the notices for that, Zach? Because I don't remember seeing that.
Yeah, 29th of April.
Seems like, I don't know. It seems like I got one for around then, but I don't remember the title, but that doesn't sound
familiar. The life of a Mesopotamian citizen. And again, Mesopotamia was pretty big, so so it's so join us for that one. And so it's going to be me and Beverly, and I'm actually inviting a couple of people from Turkey who are PhDs in archaeology. So will be interesting.
Oh, that'd be good.
Yeah,
they're actual Sumerologists.
So one person is the curator of the Istanbul Museum of Archaeology. When I went there, I kind of like connected with the person. So he's kind of, I'll find out if he needs to confirm still. Another person actually did excavation around that area. It's in Iraq, Lavash, city Lavash. which is I think a second or third city that was discovered. And as Beverly says, sounds like bread. Georgian bread. So we'll talk about, particularly as John had mentioned, nomads that attacked the area, and it'll be interesting. Hopefully, I'll get some animations involved. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and I hope everybody has an incredible rest of the weekend. And thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for staying, and thank you, John. Incredible presentation.
Yeah.
We'll look forward to the next one. Hopefully, we'll talk about the bear wolf next time.
Yeah, I'll think about it. That's a good idea.
Yeah, well, why not, right? It's the first Saxon, writing, right, ever.
Yeah.
I mean, publicized. We don't know the others. Who the hell? Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys. Have a nice the rest of the week.